The winds howled like a chorus of lamenting souls as Margaret and I made our way through the desolate countryside, each step heavier than the last. It was the year of our Lord 1643, a time when the air itself seemed thick with despair, and the shadows of war loomed over our heads like the sword of Damocles. The English Civil War had torn the country asunder, and as staunch Royalists, our loyalty to the crown had marked us for persecution. We were no longer safe in our own home, and so we fled, with only the clothes on our backs and a few meager possessions hastily packed in a single bundle. Every rustle in the underbrush, every distant crack of a twig, sent our hearts racing. The thought of being captured by parliamentary forces haunted our every breath. I remember the way Margaret clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh as if seeking reassurance that I was still there beside her. Her face, usually so serene, was pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. We had heard stories of what happened to those who were caught, stories that chilled the blood and made even the bravest men quake. But it was not just the fear of capture that gnawed at us. It was the uncertainty of what lay ahead, the knowledge that we were leaving behind everything we had ever known. The journey to O'Kelly Castle felt endless. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and foreboding. The rolling hills and ancient forests, places where I had once hunted and roamed freely, now seemed to close in around us, their once gentle embrace turned cold and unwelcoming. I could feel the weight of history pressing down upon us, the echoes of battles fought long before our time reverberating through the very ground we walked on. The sky, overcast and heavy with the promise of rain, mirrored our own heavy hearts. By the time we reached O'Kelly Castle, the night had fully descended, wrapping the world in a shroud of darkness. The castle loomed before us, its towering stone walls bathed in the pale light of a waning moon. It was a fortress of old, built to withstand the sieges of an age-long past, and yet it offered us a glimmer of hope, a sanctuary from the chaos that raged beyond its walls. As we approached the gates, I felt a flicker of relief, though it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that even these ancient walls could not keep out the horrors of the world forever. Lady Syavan O'Kelly, our dear friend and ally, welcomed us with open arms. Her presence was a balm to our frayed nerves, her voice calm and reassuring as she led us inside. The warmth of the castle's hearths was a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in our bones, and for a moment, we allowed ourselves to believe that we might finally be safe. Yet, as I looked around the grand hall, with its high ceilings and faded tapestries, I could not shake the feeling that we had merely exchanged one form of danger for another. The castle, though a refuge, was also a place of secrets, its ancient stones steeped in a history that was both glorious and tragic. As we settled into our quarters, the tension that had coiled within me began to unwind, though it never fully left. The heavy wooden door of our room, though solid, felt like a flimsy barrier against the unknown forces that seemed to lurk just beyond. Margaret, ever sensitive to the unseen, seemed to feel it too. She moved about the room in silence, her eyes darting to the shadows that flickered on the walls, cast by the dim light of a single candle. I knew she was trying to be brave, but I could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that mirrored my own. That night, as I lay beside Margaret, the events of the day replayed in my mind like a nightmare from which I could not wake. The Banshee, the harbinger of death in Irish lore, kept creeping into my thoughts, its wail a sound I had heard only in stories. My grandmother had told me of the Banshee when I was a boy, recounting the tales with such vivid detail that I could almost hear the mournful cry echoing through the misty hills of my childhood home. It was a sound that foretold death, a warning from the otherworld that someone's time had come. Though I had never heard it myself, the very idea of it sent shivers down my spine. The Banshee was not just a figure of myth. It was a manifestation of the fear that had gripped our land in these dark times. As a Royalist, I had seen how quickly death could come, how the line between life and death had grown perilously thin. The Banshee's wail was a reminder of that fragility, a sound that cut through the bravado of men and left only the stark reality of our mortality. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I could not help but wonder if the Banshee was already watching us, waiting to claim her next victim. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The sun, hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, cast a pale, lifeless light over the castle. Lady Siovan was kind enough to offer us breakfast in the great hall, but the food tasted like ash in my mouth. The other inhabitants of the castle moved about their duties with a quiet efficiency, their faces etched with the same weariness that weighed on my own heart. It was as if the castle itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Margaret and I spent the day trying to adjust to our new surroundings, but the sense of foreboding never left us. The castle, though a place of safety, was also a place of whispers and shadows. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to carry with it the weight of centuries. I could feel the history of the place pressing down on us, the ghosts of those who had lived and died within these walls still lingering in the air. As night fell once more, I knew that our journey was far from over. We had escaped the immediate danger, but we had not escaped the war, nor the specter of death that seemed to follow us wherever we went. The Banshee's wail had not yet come for us, but I could feel it, hovering just out of reach, a cold breath on the back of my neck. And so we waited, knowing that our fates were no longer in our hands, but in the hands of forces far beyond our understanding. The castle had a way of making the hours feel like days, the minutes stretching into a kind of unbearable eternity. It was during one of those long, restless nights that Margaret woke with a start, her hand clutching the blanket as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. I stirred beside her, feeling her tremble, though I was not yet fully awake. The room was deathly still, the kind of silence that makes you strain your ears, hoping to hear something, anything, that might break it. "Edmund," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet sharp with fear. "Do you hear that?" I sat up, the remnants of sleep quickly dissolving as I listened. At first, there was nothing, just the faint crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. But then, just as I was about to dismiss it as a bad dream, I heard it too, a faint wail, distant and yet piercing, as if carried on the wind from some far-off place. It was not the howl of the wind, nor the cry of an animal. No, this was something else entirely, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Margaret's grip on my arm tightened. "It's the Banshee," she said, her voice trembling with the terror of that realization. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of ancient lore and the certainty of what it foretold. I wanted to tell her that it was just the wind, that there was nothing to fear. But the truth lodged itself in my throat, refusing to be spoken. I knew, deep down, that what we were hearing was no ordinary sound. It was the cry of the Banshee, the harbinger of death, come to deliver its grim warning. And it was coming from just outside our window. Gathering what little courage I had left, I rose from the bed and crossed the room to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The night outside was pitch black, the moon obscured by thick clouds. I could see nothing but my own reflection in the glass, pale and ghostly in the dim light of the dying fire. But the wail came again, louder this time, and as I pressed my face closer to the glass, I saw her, floating just beyond the window, her form ethereal and almost transparent, her face a mask of sorrow and despair. The sight of the Banshee chilled me to the bone. She was not of this world, that much was clear. Her hair, long and white as snow, whipped about her face as if caught in a violent storm, though the air outside was still. Her eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to stare straight through me, as if seeing something far beyond my mortal comprehension. And her mouth, oh, that mouth, was open in a silent scream, the source of the wail that now filled the room with its unearthly sound. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I turned to Margaret, who was now sitting up in bed, her face as white as the Banshee's hair. "We must tell Lady Siovan," I managed to say, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. "She will know what to do." Margaret nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear. We dressed quickly, our hands shaking as we fumbled with our clothes, and then hurried through the dark corridors of the castle to Lady Sioven's chambers. The castle seemed even more oppressive now, its stone walls closing in on us as we made our way through the labyrinthine hallways. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the silence, a stark reminder that we were very much alone in the world. When we reached Lady Sioben's chambers, she was already awake, as if she had been expecting us. She opened the door at the first knock, her expression grave as she looked from Margaret to me and back again. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside to allow us entry. Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she clasped her hands tightly together, as if to keep them from trembling. We told her what we had seen and heard, our words tumbling over one another in our haste to convey the horror of the encounter. Lady Sioven listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each passing moment. When we had finished, she was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond our view. Finally, she spoke. "The Banshee's wail is a warning," she said, her voice low and measured. "It is said that when she appears, death follows swiftly. But it is not always clear for whom the wail is intended." She paused, her gaze shifting to the window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the curtains. We must be prepared for what is to come. The day that followed was one of unbearable tension. The entire household was on edge, the servants moving about with hushed voices and worried glances. Lady Sioven, normally so composed and strong, seemed weighed down by an invisible burden, her movements slow and deliberate as she oversaw the day's activities. Margaret and I stayed close to her, feeling the need to be near someone who might understand what we were facing, though the truth was that none of us could fully grasp the enormity of it. That evening, just as the sun was setting, a rider arrived at the castle with news. Lady Sioven's cousin, who had been visiting relatives in a nearby village, had died suddenly and without warning. The message was brief, delivered in a few terse sentences, but its impact was profound. The Banshee's wail had been for him, and the knowledge that we had heard the very sound that had marked his passing filled us with a deep, bone-chilling dread. The castle fell into mourning that night, the atmosphere heavy with grief and fear. Margaret and I returned to our quarters, the silence between us filled with unspoken thoughts. We knew now that the Banshee's wail was not just a story, not just an old wives' tale told to scare children. It was real, and it had touched our lives in a way we could never have imagined. As I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I could still hear that wail echoing in my mind, a sound that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my days. Our stay at O'Kelly Castle, though filled with dread and the looming presence of the Banshee, was not the last time we would encounter the harbinger of death. I had thought that perhaps we had escaped her notice, that she had taken her toll with Lady Sioven's cousin and moved on. But death, once it sets its eyes on you, does not easily look away. And so, as fate would have it, our lives became inextricably linked with the Banshee's mournful cry, even when we were far from O'Kelly Castle, even when we had crossed oceans and time itself. It was some years later that I found myself once again in the company of old friends, this time in the grand Roswell estate, nestled deep in the rolling hills of Ireland. The estate belonged to Baron Callum Roswell, a man of great wealth and influence, though his years of service in the military had left him with a haunted look, as if he carried with him the weight of every life he had taken. My presence there was not merely a social visit. I had come to discuss matters of some urgency with Sir Declan Farrington, a judge and politician who had been staying at the estate with his wife. We were all bound together by the tumultuous events of our time, and the Roswell estate offered a temporary refuge from the storm that raged outside. The estate itself was a testament to the Baron's power and wealth. The grand halls, lined with portraits of ancestors long dead, seemed to whisper secrets from the past. The gardens, though meticulously maintained, felt more like a battleground where nature fought against the Baron's attempts to tame it. There was a stillness to the place, a quiet that seemed unnatural, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. It was on the second night of our stay that the Banshee made her presence known once more. I had retired early, the day's discussions weighing heavily on my mind. Sleep, however, did not come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ornate ceiling of my guest room, my thoughts drifting back to O'Kelly Castle and the ominous wail that had echoed through its halls. The memory was still fresh, the terror still palpable. And then, just as I was on the verge of sleep, I heard it. The same mournful wail, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. My heart froze, the sound pulling me from the edge of sleep and into a waking nightmare. I knew that cry all too well. It was the Banshee, her wail piercing the silence of the night, just as it had done before. I rose from my bed, my legs unsteady as I moved towards the door. In the hallway, I encountered Sir Declan, his face as pale as the moonlight that filtered through the windows. His wife stood beside him, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak, the dread settling in my stomach like a stone. There was no need for words. We all knew what the Banshee's wail signified. It was a warning, a death knell, and it had come for someone within these walls. The three of us made our way to the Baron's chambers, the wail following us, growing louder, more insistent. The halls that had once seemed grand and imposing now felt like the corridors of a tomb, cold and lifeless. When we reached the Baron's door, it was ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. We hesitated for a moment, each of us bracing for what we might find inside. Pushing the door open, we found the Baron sitting upright in his bed, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He had heard the wail too, and there was no mistaking the fear that gripped him. "The Banshee," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She has come for me." We tried to offer him comfort, but there was little we could do. The Baron's fate was sealed, just as surely as if it had been written in the stars. The Banshee's wail had chosen him, and there was no escaping it. All we could do was sit with him, waiting for the inevitable. The hours dragged on, the night seeming to stretch into eternity. The wail, though it had faded into the distance, lingered in our minds, a constant reminder of the doom that hung over us. The Baron, once a man of great strength and resolve, now appeared fragile, his hands shaking as he clutched the blankets around him. He spoke little, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond our reach, as if he could see the Banshee herself, waiting in the shadows. When dawn finally broke, it was with a heavy heart that we watched the Baron take his last breath. He passed quietly, the fear leaving his face as he slipped into death's embrace. The Banshee's wail had been fulfilled, her warning heeded, and with the Baron's passing, the oppressive weight that had filled the estate seemed to lift, though the sorrow remained. We buried the Baron in the family plot, his grave marked by a simple stone, but the memory of that night would stay with us forever. The Banshee had once again proven that her reach extended far beyond the walls of any castle or estate. She was a force of nature, relentless and unforgiving, and no one, no matter their station or strength, could escape her call. As we departed the Roswell estate, I could not help but feel that this was not the end of our encounters with the Banshee, but merely another chapter in a story that had been unfolding for centuries. Years had passed since the death of Baron Roswell, and life had carried me far from the green hills of Ireland to the untamed wilderness of the American colonies. The world was changing rapidly, the fires of revolution sparking in the hearts of men across the Atlantic. I found myself in North Carolina, far from the familiar landscapes of my youth, yet I was no stranger to the turbulence that gripped this new land. The struggle for independence had turned neighbors into enemies, and once again, the specter of war loomed large over our lives. The Tar River, which flowed through the heart of this rugged land, had become a lifeline for many settlers, its waters a source of sustenance and trade. It was along this river that I first met Eamon Kavanagh, a man whose spirit matched the wildness of the land he called home. Eamon was a miller by trade. but his heart beat with the fire of a patriot, fiercely loyal to the cause of independence. He had come from Ireland, much like myself, seeking a new life in the colonies, and though our paths had crossed only briefly, I felt a kinship with him that was hard to ignore. Eamon was not one to shy away from speaking his mind, and it was this very trait that put him at odds with the British soldiers who patrolled the area. The soldiers, tasked with maintaining order in the increasingly rebellious colonies, saw Eamon as a threat, a man who could inspire others to rise against the crown. Tensions between Eamon and the soldiers escalated quickly, their encounters growing more hostile with each passing day. The last time I saw Eamon, he was defiant, unbowed by the threats of violence that loomed over him. He had laughed when I warned him to be cautious, his eyes gleaming with the fierce determination of a man who would not be cowed. It was not long after that our worst fears were realized. The news spread quickly through the small settlement. Eamon Kavanagh had been murdered by British soldiers. They had caught him near the river, alone and unarmed, and had beaten him to death in cold blood. His body was found the next morning, lying on the banks of the Tar River, his lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. The settlers, already on edge, were outraged, their anger simmering just below the surface, threatening to boil over into open rebellion. But it was not just the settlers who reacted to Eamon's death. That night, as the sun set over the river, the Banshee came. I heard her wail long before I saw her, the sound carrying across the water like a lament for the dead. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the mournful cry grew louder, filling the air with a sorrow that seemed to seep into my very bones. I knew that sound all too well, knew it as surely as I knew my own name. The Banshee had crossed the ocean, just as we had, her presence a reminder that death knew no borders, no boundaries. I ventured to the riverbank, driven by a morbid curiosity and a deep, gnawing fear. The night was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moon that hung low in the sky. The river, usually so calm and peaceful, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its surface disturbed by unseen forces. And there, standing at the edge of the water, was the Banshee. Her form was just as I remembered, ethereal, otherworldly, her long white hair flowing around her like mist. Her wail pierced the night, a sound that was both a cry of mourning and a harbinger of vengeance. The British soldiers who had murdered Eamon were camped nearby, and it was to them that the Banshee directed her wrath. Over the next few days, strange occurrences began to plague the camp. The soldiers, once so sure of their power, were reduced to trembling wrecks, their nights filled with nightmares of death and despair. They spoke of seeing the Banshee in the shadows, her eyes burning with a cold, unearthly light. Their food spoiled, their fires refused to stay lit, and the very air around them seemed thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. One by one, the soldiers met their fates. Some were found drowned in the river, their bodies bloated and lifeless, as if they had been pulled under by unseen hands. Others died in their sleep, their faces twisted in terror, as if they had been visited by the Banshee herself in the dead of night. The few who survived fled the area, their minds broken, their spirits crushed. The settlers whispered that it was Eamon's spirit, avenged by the Banshee, who had exacted this terrible justice. Whether it was the Banshee alone, or the combined force of Eamon's restless soul and her mournful cry, none could say for certain. But the result was clear. The soldiers had paid for their brutality with their lives. As for me, I could not help but feel a deep, unsettling sense of familiarity in all that had transpired. The Banshee, once a figure of Irish legend, had become a reality in this new land. Her presence was a reminder that death followed wherever we went, that no matter how far we traveled, we could not escape the past. The Banshee was not bound to the green hills of Ireland. She had come to America. And with her she had brought the weight of centuries of sorrow and loss. In the days that followed, I found myself lingering by the riverbank, listening for the sound of her wail, half expecting to see her form rise from the mist once more. But the Banshee had done her work, and she was gone, leaving only the echoes of her cry and the cold, stark reality of death in her wake. The settlers moved on, as people always do, but I knew that the Banshee would remain with us, a shadow on our hearts, a reminder that we were never truly free from the past. And so I continued my journey through this new land, haunted by the knowledge that the Banshee's wail was never far behind, always waiting, always watching. In the days following Eamon Kavanagh's murder, the British soldiers who had taken his life began to unravel. It was as if the very fabric of their reality had been torn apart, leaving them exposed to forces they neither understood nor could resist. I watched from a distance, aware that something far greater than simple vengeance was at play. The Banshee, who had made her presence known so vividly on that fateful night by the Tar River, had not finished her work. Her wail was no mere prelude. It was a death sentence, and the soldiers were its doomed recipients. The first signs of their descent into madness were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they soon grew impossible to ignore. At first it was just whispers among the men, talk of strange dreams, of shadows that seemed to move on their own, of an eerie chill that settled over the camp at night. These were seasoned soldiers, men who had faced the horrors of battle without flinching, yet now they quaked at the rustling of leaves or the sight of a cloud passing across the moon. They claimed to hear the Banshee's wail, though no one else in the settlement had heard it since the night of Eamon's death. But I believed them, for I had heard that wail before, and I knew its power. As the days wore on, the soldiers became increasingly paranoid. They began to see the Banshee everywhere, in the mist that rose from the river at dawn, in the dark corners of their tents, in the reflections of their own eyes. They spoke of her with a kind of terrified reverence, as if she were not just a harbinger of death, but death itself, come to collect what was owed. Their once disciplined ranks began to disintegrate, the men turning on each other in their fear, suspecting that some among them might be cursed or marked for death. The air around their camp grew thick with tension, a tension that seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger with each passing hour. Then the deaths began. The first soldier was found one morning, his body floating in the river, his face twisted in an expression of unimaginable terror. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds to explain his death, only the look of pure horror that had frozen on his features. The other soldiers found him and recoiled in fear, whispering that the Banshee had taken him, that she had claimed her first victim. They buried him quickly, their hands shaking as they dug his grave, all the while casting nervous glances over their shoulders, as if expecting the Banshee to appear at any moment. But the Banshee did not need to appear in physical form to wreak her havoc. Her presence was felt in every breath of wind, every flicker of shadow, every creak of the trees that surrounded the camp. The soldiers began to lose sleep, their nights plagued by visions of the Banshee, her pale face and hollow eyes filling their dreams. They spoke of her standing over their beds, her cold breath on their faces, her wail ringing in their ears. Some claimed that she whispered their names in the dark, calling them to their deaths. They tried to stay awake, to avoid the dreams that awaited them, but exhaustion soon claimed them, and the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. One by one, the soldiers succumbed to the Banshee's curse. Another was found dead in his tent, his heart stopped as if from sheer fright. Others simply disappeared, vanishing into the night without a trace, their fates left to the dark waters of the Tar River or the dense forests that surrounded the camp. The few who remained were reduced to trembling wrecks, their minds shattered by fear. They spoke of seeing Eamon's ghost, of hearing his voice mingled with the Banshee's wail, accusing them of their crimes, promising them retribution. It was as if the Banshee had woven herself into the very fabric of their reality, turning their world into a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. The final blow came when the leader of the soldiers, a man known for his iron will and ruthless efficiency, was found dead in the river, his body half submerged, his face locked in the same expression of terror as the others. His death broke what little resolve remained among the soldiers. They fled the area in a panic, abandoning their camp, their weapons, and even their fallen comrades. They were no longer soldiers of the crown but broken men, driven to the brink of madness by a force they could not comprehend. As they disappeared into the wilderness, their cries of fear echoed through the trees, a fitting accompaniment to the Banshee's mournful wail. I stood by the riverbank in the days that followed, watching as the land slowly reclaimed the abandoned camp. The tents fell into disrepair, the fires long extinguished, the once bustling site now silent and still. The Banshee's work was done, and she had left behind only echoes of her presence, whispers in the wind, and the memory of her terrible power. The settlers, who had lived in fear of the soldiers, now breathed easier, though they too spoke of the Banshee in hushed tones, acknowledging her role in delivering justice. In the end, the Banshee had shown that she was more than just a messenger of death. She was an avenger, a force of nature that punished those who brought death and suffering upon the innocent. Her presence in this new land was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful or far from home, could escape the consequences of their actions. The Banshee had woven herself into the very history of this place, her wail now part of the lore of the Tar River, a story to be told for generations to come. And as I stood by the river, the water lapping gently at the shore, I knew that I would carry the memory of that wail with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. Returning to Ireland after my years in the American colonies felt like stepping back into an old, familiar dream, one tinged with both comfort and unease. The rolling hills and ancient stone walls that had once been the backdrop of my youth now seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the land itself remembered the blood that had been spilled, the lives that had been lost. And in that landscape, the Banshee's wail, though distant in time and space, still echoed in my memory, a reminder of the inexorable march of death that seemed to follow wherever I went. It was not long after my return that I found myself once more in the company of those who had shared in the Banshee's haunting presence. Sir Declan Farrington, now an older man but no less sharp in mind, had summoned me to discuss matters that, though of great political import, seemed to carry an undercurrent of something darker, something unspoken. The gathering at the Roswell estate had left its mark on all of us, and the years had not softened the memory of that night when the Banshee's cry had signaled the end for Baron Roswell. As we sat in a quiet study, the fire crackling in the hearth, Sir Declan spoke of the unease that had settled over the land, a sense of foreboding that seemed to hang in the air. "The Banshee," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "she's not done with us. I've heard her wail again, just last night, and I fear what it means." His words sent a shiver down my spine, for they confirmed what I had long suspected. The Banshee's reach extended far beyond any one place or time. She was not bound to Ireland, nor to the American colonies. She was a force of nature, relentless and unyielding. The thought that her wail could be heard again, after all these years, filled me with a dread that was as old as the hills themselves. It was later that night, as the moon cast long shadows across the land, that I heard the wail myself. I was lying in bed, my thoughts drifting between the past and the present, when the sound cut through the silence like a knife. It was distant, yet clear, a mournful cry that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath me. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me that death was near. The Banshee had returned, and her wail was a harbinger of doom for someone close. I rushed to the window, throwing open the shutters to peer into the darkness. The landscape outside was still and quiet, the night air heavy with an unnatural calm. But I could feel her presence, as surely as if she were standing right beside me. The Banshee was out there, somewhere in the night, her wail a signal that death was coming, and nothing could stop it. The days that followed were filled with a tension that hung over everyone like a storm cloud. Those who had heard the wail spoke in hushed tones, their eyes wide with fear, while others who had not heard it still sensed that something was terribly wrong. Sir Declan and I spoke often during this time, our conversations circling back again and again to the Banshee. as if by speaking of her we could somehow ward off the inevitable. But deep down, we both knew that her wail was not a thing that could be reasoned with or avoided. It was a warning, a promise of what was to come. The climax came on a night, much like the one when Baron Roswell had met his fate. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence so complete that even the usual sounds of the night seemed to have fled in fear. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, the wail came again, louder this time, more insistent. It filled the house, reverberating off the walls, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. We all rushed to the source of the wail, hearts pounding with the knowledge that death was near. And there in his bed, we found Sir Declan, his face pale and drawn, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked up at us, his eyes filled with a terrible understanding, and we knew that the Banshee's wail had been for him. He spoke only a few words, his voice weak but clear. "The Banshee, she has come for me." We tried to comfort him, to tell him that all would be well, but we knew the truth as surely as he did. The Banshee's wail had never been wrong, and now it was only a matter of time. We sat with him through the night, listening to the wail as it echoed in our ears, a relentless reminder that death was close at hand. As dawn broke, Sir Declan took his last breath, his face finally at peace. The wail ceased, the silence that followed more deafening than any sound. The Banshee had claimed another life, and with her departure, the tension that had gripped us all seemed to lift, though the sorrow remained. In the days that followed, I reflected on the power of the Banshee, on how her presence seemed to weave itself through the very fabric of our lives. She was not just a figure of folklore, not just a ghostly apparition to frighten children. She was a constant, a reminder that death is never far away, that no matter how far we travel or how much time passes, we cannot escape the inevitable. The Banshee's wail was a thread that connected us all, binding us to the past, the present, and the future in a way that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. For in her wail, I heard not just a warning of death, but a call to remember those who had passed, to honor their lives and their memories. And as I left Sir Declan's house for the last time, I knew that I would carry the sound of that wail with me always, a constant reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead, and of the Banshee who watches over us all. The morning after Sir Declan's passing was somber and still. The house, once filled with the quiet hum of life, now felt like a tomb, its halls echoing with the memories of conversations that would never be had again. I lingered longer than I should have, perhaps out of a need to make sense of all that had happened, or perhaps because leaving felt like an acknowledgement that another chapter of my life had closed. The Banshee's wail had done more than just foretell the end of a friend. It had marked the end of something within me as well, a final severing of ties with the past I had tried so hard to hold on to. As I walked through the rooms where Sir Declan had lived and worked, I felt a deep sense of inevitability. His death, like those of Baron Roswell, Eamon Kavanagh, and Lady Siobhan's cousin, was part of a pattern, a web woven by the Banshee that connected us all. It was a pattern that I could not escape, no matter how far I traveled or how much time passed. The Banshee's wail had become a constant in my life, a reminder that death was always near, waiting just beyond the veil. But in this realization came a strange sense of peace. The Banshee, once a figure of terror, now seemed almost like an old acquaintance, one who had accompanied me through the darkest moments of my life, guiding me through loss and sorrow. Her wail, though chilling, was not just a harbinger of death, but also a call to remember, to honor those who had passed. It was as if she was telling me that death was not something to be feared, but something to be accepted, a natural part of the cycle of life. The days that followed Sir Declan's death were filled with reflection. I wandered the countryside, the familiar landscape of Ireland, now tinged with the memories of all that had happened. The hills and valleys, the ancient stone walls and quiet streams, all seemed to whisper of the past, of lives lived and lost, of the Banshee who watched over it all. I found myself thinking often of the stories my grandmother had told me as a child, of the Banshee and her role in our lives. Back then, they had been just stories, meant to frighten and entertain. But now I understood that they were much more than that. They were the threads that connected us to our ancestors, to the land, to the very essence of what it meant to be human. One evening, as I sat by the fire in the small cottage I had taken refuge in, I heard a sound that made me pause. It was not the Banshee's wail, but something quieter, more distant. A memory of the sound, echoing in my mind. It was then that I realized that the Banshee had not come for me, not yet. But her presence in my life was undeniable, and I knew that when my time came, I would hear her wail once more. It would be a final call, not just for me, but for all those I had loved and lost along the way. In the end, the Banshee's wail was not just a sound of mourning, but a bridge between the living and the dead, a reminder that we are all part of a greater whole. The deaths she had foretold were not just tragedies, but necessary passages, steps along the path that we all must walk. And as I came to terms with this, I felt a sense of acceptance wash over me. The fear that had once gripped me at the thought of the Banshee's wail was gone, replaced by a deep understanding of its true meaning. As I prepared to leave Ireland once again, this time with no clear destination in mind, I took one last look at the land that had shaped me, the land where the Banshee's wail had first touched my life. I knew that I would carry the memory of her cry with me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. But it was also a reminder of the strength that comes from facing that inevitability, of the peace that can be found in accepting the things we cannot change. The Banshee's wail had once filled me with dread, but now it was a part of me, a sound that connected me to my past, to my ancestors, and to the land I called home. And as I walked away from the cottage, the evening sky darkening above me, I felt a calmness that I had not felt in years. The Banshee's work was done, and so was mine, at least for now. But I knew that somewhere, in the distance, she was still watching, still waiting, her wail ready to call out when the time came. And when that moment arrived, I would be ready, not with fear, but with a quiet acceptance, knowing that I had lived my life in the shadow of her cry, and that I would join those who had gone before me, on the other side of that mournful, beautiful sound.